My name is Rabbi Ryan Daniels. I'd like to welcome you again. And it's really great to be here with you. Of course, for everybody else joining us, you probably remember Ed Sherman was a longtime sports writer for the Chicago Tribune. He's the author of 4 books, including most recently, This is Big, A History of the Big Ten. You also, of course, as we talked about through the Jews in Sports series, developed that comprehensive site on the history of Jews in baseball, jewishbaseballmuseum.com. But the guest here in our space and the star of tonight's show is Dan Grunfeld. Dan, we want to thank you for joining us. We understand right now you're in the DC area, and an introduction that I think everybody has read the book and certainly knows who you are, but let me offer another introduction. Dan Grunfeld is the former professional basketball player, an accomplished writer, and a proud graduate of Stanford University, an academic All-American and All-Conference basketball selection at Stanford. Dan, you played professionally for 8 seasons in top leagues around the world, including Germany, Spain, and Israel. Dan's writings has published more than 40 times in media outlets such as Sports Illustrated, the Jerusalem Post, NBC News. Dan went on to earn an MBA from Stanford Graduate School of Business in 2017 and lives with your wife and your first son in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, where you work as a venture capitalist. Of course, right now in the DC area, messing around with time zones.
Yeah.
Shout out to Molly Dillon, who I see here on our screen. Molly connected us with Dan initially and helped to make this all happen. So Molly, as we see you there.
Rabbi Daniels, you beat me to it. Definitely big shout out to Molly, to Karen and Robert as well. Dear friends and supporters, so I want to say hello. Also, my friend Roberta Goodman, who's here. It's really great to be with you all tonight.
That's awesome. Dan, when Ed and I were talking about this series, and we were talking about when we would schedule this kind of a conversation, and Molly was in the conversation too, I said to Ed, well, let's look towards March, because in that second week of March, it's right before Purim. It's the story of perseverance and a Jewish hero story. I said, and Passover is just a little bit later, and it's a story of freedom and redemption and all these wonderful themes. And I was thinking about recent rise in anti-Semitism and the importance of talking about anti-Semitism and hate against Jews in America and around the globe. And of course, Ed, the sports writer, said, yeah, and it's March Madness.
I thought it was in March. Yeah, perfect. It's March Madness. That's why he's giving me all this litany of, Purim and Passover. And I'm like, okay, this is the way mine works. It's March Madness. Talk basketball.
Right. Love it, yeah.
So I guess it sort of leads me to a first question for you. There are so many reasons why I think that this book is important, but I'm wondering, what was your inspiration? Why did you write it? What was your hope?
So I always grew up feeling the profound impact that basketball had on my family. I've always been very close with my grandmother, who we were chatting, before folks came in. She'll be 97 in June, lives in the Bay Area. I talked to her about an hour ago. She's doing so well. And, very thick European accent. I knew that, things had happened to her in her background, knew she had survived the Holocaust, and knew that my dad, came to America as an immigrant, found basketball, and it had brought, it had shined its light on our family when we most needed it and kind of changed our trajectory. And so I felt this growing up. And as I got older, learned more details of the story, I had the opportunity to go to Stanford, which is 25 minutes from my grandmother. We lived with her during the summers, would ask her questions, learn more and more. And it just became my dream to tell this story. It felt so universal and relatable, because of the things you mentioned that are going on in our world today that always have been. And so for all those reasons, I said, you know what, this is the story I want to tell. And I love to write. And so it became kind of my mission. And the book came out roughly 3 months ago, but I've been working on it for more than 5 years. So truly a labor of love.
No, Dan, I really enjoyed the book. It was a terrific book. And before we kind of get started, I want to establish, for people of a certain age, we remember your father, especially your father at Tennessee. Rabbi, if you have that video, and your father with Bernard King, two of the great, one of the greatest duos of all time. Would they average 60 points a game between them? I mean, it was insane, and they were a great pair, and such a memorable pair because of their different backgrounds. That ESPN 30 for 30 did a documentary, Bernie and Ernie, on them, because Bernard King came from the projects and your dad was an immigrant from Romania, and they formed this great, just, talk about, for people who aren't my age, kind of your father as a college player, NBA player, and also, longtime NBA executive. I mean, he's had a terrific career.
Yeah, and it's particularly interesting when you contextualize it, which we will, about where he came from, right? And when he first got to America. But hey, listen, my dad was a legendary high school basketball player in New York City, one of the most highly recruited players in the country, played collegiately at Tennessee, as Ed mentioned, was a legendary college player. Him and Bernard were called the Ernie and Bernie show.
If I can interrupt, they were on the cover of Sports Illustrated. I mean, that's the kind of players, when it meant something to be on the cover of Sports Illustrated.
They did. I mean, they took the nation by storm. I mean, to this day, people still say, "Oh, Ernie and Bernie, I have the Sports Illustrated." What's very cool is that they still talk every month. And Bernard texted me a month ago and telling me he was proud of me for the book. And, and that's kind of the theme of the book, right? Is basketball bringing different types of people together, being a bridge. And it was definitely that for my dad and Bernard. But so in high school and college, my dad was a transcendent basketball player. Right. And in the NBA, he was more of a role player. I mean, he was the 11th pick in the NBA draft. He had a successful 9-year career, but he wasn't a superstar. Bernard King was. Bernard King led the league in scoring. My dad was more of a role player, but when he retired, he joined the Knicks as a broadcaster, quickly rose up the ranks there, and became the general manager of the team for the 90s with those great New York Knicks teams who used to battle the Chicago Bulls.
Right.
I used to go, my family, we would fly to Chicago, go to the United Center, and Michael Jordan would break our hearts every year. So I want to say I have fond memories of that, but they weren't fond, but they're memories. And, but yeah, and then my dad was the general manager of the Milwaukee Bucks and the Washington Wizards. So more than a 30-year career as a GM. He's one of the longest tenured lead executives in NBA history. So really this kind of storybook basketball career, but as we know, and as we'll learn, it started out, in a kind of a different trajectory.
I think that, Rabbi, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I'm wondering, we can show this clip.
Okay, sure.
Clip to hammer some of that home.
Please.
Here he comes, Ernie Grunfeld to the Volunteers, a junior from Forest Hills, New York.
In the long and proud history of Tennessee basketball, Ernie Grunfeld ranks as one of the most productive, most decorated, and most popular players ever to wear the orange and white.
5-footer bottom. Big bucket, Grunfeld's got 21. A swish from Ernie G.
Born in Romania, he moved to Forest Hills, New York with his family in 1964. His parents, both Holocaust survivors, opened a fabric store in the South Bronx. While Ernie was learning to speak English, he also learned the game of basketball on the playgrounds in Queens. He became one of the best players in the New York area high school ranks, and he caught the eye of Tennessee coach Ray Mears and assistant coach Stu Aberdeen. Ernie Grunfeld arrived in Big Orange Country in 1973 and made an immediate impact on Tennessee basketball. In his freshman year, he was named first team All-SEC as he averaged 17 points per game. Grunfeld combined a strong slashing style with a deadly jump shot to quickly become one of the best players in the SEC. During his sophomore season, a dynamic freshman by the name of Bernard King joined the squad. Tennessee basketball would never be the same.
This is Grunfeld, bounce past King, King for a layup, good!
The Ernie and Bernie Show drew rave reviews all over the SEC and around the nation. Ernie Grunfeld was a dominant player, earning All-SEC honors 4 straight years. Twice he was named First Team All-America. In 1976, he led the SEC in scoring at over 25 points per game. In 1977, he was named the SEC Player of the Year as he led Tennessee to the SEC Championship. Ernie Grunfeld, one of the greatest players in the history of Tennessee and SEC basketball.
He can play. He can hoop it up.
Yeah, thank you for showing that. I mean, I would have a hard time wiping the smile off my face. It's so. It's so cool to see. And yeah, that says it. I mean, since the book has come out, I've had so many people from Tennessee, from Knoxville, reach out to me and just showing their appreciation. But they say to me, Dan, like, you think you know what it was like, but you don't know. And they call it Ernie G mania. My dad is the most low key person in the world, and
Right.
he's very, very humble, kind of quiet. But it was a phenomenon. It was truly larger than life.
Yeah, and I said, if you have a chance, if you have ESPN Plus, that documentary 30 for 30, Bernie and Ernie, I just actually rewatched it the other day. It's a great film about their relationship and how they came from different backgrounds.
That's right.
For those who have enjoyed this book already, and I hope if you haven't that you will after this conversation, you do this incredible job of flipping back and forth the story of basketball and your immediate family story, both yours and your father's, as well as Anya's story of surviving and persevering, and the story of the Holocaust and the war and how she became who she is today. I'm wondering for you, is there a favorite story that you share in your book about either Dad or Anya?
Wow, it's a great question. Yeah, you mentioned the structure, right? Alternating, and that was probably the biggest choice I made. When you write a book, you make 1,000 choices. Everything is a choice. And for me, the structure of telling this really complicated, deep, complex, intergenerational story, I thought the best way to do it was to alternate. It was a risk, by the way. And my wife, Sam, was the first one to read the book. And I remember asking, like, does it work? And she was like, it works. But then I still wanted to get that feedback, and I did. And I think it does work. So thank you for calling that out. There's so many stories that I loved writing, because when I wrote them, I lived inside those moments, and so like it just, by the way, there were a lot of moments that were hard as well. And you read the book, you probably know which ones I'm referring to, and I'm sure we'll talk about them a bit later. Probably my favorite story to write was when it's kind of two stories, right? When my dad comes to the United States and he's picked on and he's bullied, right? He doesn't speak English, had never touched a basketball. And, his older brother passed away, which I'm sure we'll get into, which is probably the biggest tragedy in my family's history. And, my dad was basically beat up at the park in Queens, right, by an older kid picked on him. And so, but as you know from reading the book, my dad got the last laugh, right? And when he was one of the best players in New York City, they kind of faced off again on the court, and the tables were turned. And it was just, it was so fun to write it because it's such like a triumphant moment, and it's funny and it's cool. So like, I just loved writing that story.
Hey, Dan, I'm kind of curious though, because you get into such detail about the horrors that your grandparents had to go through during the Holocaust and just trying to survive and all. I mean, it's incredible. How much though did you know going in? Did you know all those stories? Did they talk about it much with you? Sometimes we've heard stories where the Holocaust survivors, sometimes they don't want to share. It's hard for them to relive it. I mean, how much did you know, and how much did you have to go research and find out even further?
I knew the framework. My grandfather unfortunately passed away when I was a baby, but I've always been so close with my grandma. We talked about it. I remember in college, I'd stay at her house during the summers and we'd eat dinner and I'd be taking notes, just asking questions. But for my book, I did 1.5 years of research, and my grandma and my dad were my primary sources. I did hundreds of hours of interviews with each of them. So I would record them, transcribe them. And it was really in those interviews that I got all that really, really rich, vivid detail. You're right. Oftentimes with Holocaust survivors, it's a binary. Either they don't want to talk about it, or it's almost an obligation. And my grandmother was in the latter camp. And so she has this incredible, insane memory where she just remembers the most minute details. But for this story, it really wove together like a very rich fabric. And so, yeah, I learned a ton. I tried to be very just real about what happened. And I've had some people say to me, the book was great, we loved it, but it was difficult to read some of those details about the Holocaust. And my response has been, yeah, it should be. You can't sanitize history.
And you're right. And your grandmother had lived in, correct me if I'm my memory, she was in Budapest, or she was in Hungary when the Germans came in, and she had to go into hiding, correct? Because otherwise she probably wouldn't have been here. I mean, talk a little bit about how she survived that period. That was when the Germans were just going in and they decided to kill people and, kill everyone in Hungary, the Jews in Hungary.
There were dozens of examples of instances in my grandmother's experience where if one thing would have gone a little differently, none of us would be on this call right now because I wouldn't be here, right? That's the effect of, the smallest decisions. And as you know from reading the book, my grandmother is a fighter. She's disciplined. She has this amazing will to live, but she also has incredible perspective and humility because she'll be the first one to say, you could have all that. You could have had all that during the Holocaust, and it didn't matter. She had friends who applied the same level of discipline, and so much was out of your control. So she really credits the help of others, for in addition to the things that she did. But when the Nazis invaded Hungary, so my grandmother's from Transylvania on the border of Romania and Hungary, and it went back and forth during the war, but it became Hungary when the Nazis invaded. My grandma was visiting her older sister in Budapest, and so the rest of her family was taken to Auschwitz, but she had a chance to survive. And so it was Raoul Wallenberg, the legendary Swedish diplomat who is regarded as one of the greatest heroes of the Holocaust. He saved my grandma's life twice, once by issuing a protective passport called a Schutz pass. And by the way, my grandma got one for herself, but she also risked her life to obtain 17 passes for other people. So I always say my grandma is not only my hero, she's also a hero, because she is. She saved other people. And she was eventually caught by the Nazis. That pass wasn't recognized after some time, and she was put in the Budapest ghetto. And and the story. It's really an amazing story for the book, where she was reunited with a brother there, and at the end of the war, they saw the Nazis enter the ghetto with machine guns, and word quickly spread that they were there to kill the remaining 80,000 Jews in the ghetto. And so my grandmother and her brother raced up the stairs of the building they were hiding in. They found a small attic space. They crammed in there. And they waited for 10 minutes and 20 minutes and an hour, and nothing happened. They went out to check, and the Nazis were gone. The ghetto was soon liberated. And my grandmother, that's how she survived. And she never knew why the Nazis left, but she was free. 40 years later, when a movie came out about Raoul Wallenberg with Richard Chamberlain playing the title character, she learned that it was Wallenberg who raced to the gates of the ghetto and pleaded with the general to call off the massacre. He said, "The war is over. You will hang for this. You'll be a murderer." And it was Wallenberg who saved her life twice. So that's how she survived. And my grandfather, who we've talked about, he was in a forced labor camp in Hungary, and so he didn't have it easy by any stretch, but he had it easier than my grandma. I mean, my grandma really, she survived by the skin of her teeth on more than one occasion.
The book, as I was reading it, it just I said to Ed earlier, it has such a Jewish soul. The way that you speak of food, particularly Jewish food, and your family's food, and the history that you share, such a Jewish history, but also the perseverance, right? We are in the shadows of the holiday of Purim next week, where we talk about the mighty Esther, a Jewish female hero of our tradition. And I can't help but think about your grandmother in that same position, saving herself, saving her family, and establishing who you said who you are today. I'm wondering if you could speak to the perseverance and that theme throughout, because then I can also say that same scene that you write about of your major injury, and your grandmother's the first person at your side as they look to your leg, we talk about your dad and his overcoming all of the odds to become the person who he is, that overcoming, the perseverance, the grit, that Jewish neshama and soul. I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. And listen, perseverance is one of the main themes of the book, and the book is just a reflection of the story. This is my family story, and that's really the main theme, right? From surviving the war. Then my grandparents spent more than a decade under communism in Romania, which wasn't easy, and they endured a lot of brutality and persecution there. They had to flee as refugees. And so at every step of the way, there were challenges. And my grandma always says, it's not what happens to you in life, it's how you respond to what happens to you in life. And yes, it is a very Jewish story. There certainly is a Jewish soul, and not only for the perseverance, for the food, of course. We love to eat, we love to feed each other, right? That's a big part of it. In my dad's case, that thread just, it's very smooth, because when he comes to the United States as a 9-year-old boy, doesn't speak English, has never touched a basketball, and my dad had an older brother, and I mentioned him a little bit prior, who was 8 years older than him. And what my dad called my uncle in Hungarian, their native language, translates in English to my king. That's how much he loved and revered his older brother. And he was diagnosed with leukemia not long after arriving in the United States and passed away within a year. And that's was such a crushing loss. It's the biggest tragedy in the history of my family. It's a hole that still can't be filled. And so for my dad, as that kind of at-risk immigrant youth in America, born from the ashes of the Holocaust, losing his brother, to find basketball at the park in New York City and to kind of overcome what he went through, defy the odds. Yeah, that kind of line of perseverance just kept going. And then here I am, born into privilege with opportunities and resources my ancestors couldn't have imagined, my dad and grandmother couldn't have imagined. And yet, of course, we all have different types of challenges in our lives. And you mentioned one that I faced, which was a very traumatic injury at a very inopportune time when I was playing college basketball at Stanford. And I was an inch away from fulfilling my dream of becoming an NBA player. And not only was that so meaningful to me because my dad was a great player, but I had, my grandmother's family didn't get a chance to live out their dreams, and I've always carried that with me. And so that injury was really crushing. But you mentioned my grandmother was sitting 20 feet away. And when I finally kind of came to my senses, still on the floor, writhing in agony, she was kneeling next to me, rubbing my head. So she was there, and I had her example, and I felt the weight of that injury. I mourned it, but then I, put my head down, got to work, tried to have a good attitude, and because I had the most amazing examples of what it takes to kind of overcome challenges.
And you talk a little bit, just for some background for people who didn't read the book, you were the son of an NBA player, and you talked a little bit about the challenge that was involved in that because people had very high expectations for you. And you had set your sights out on wanting to play for Stanford. And it wasn't like a straight line getting there where you were immediately recruited and you worked your tail off to get to Stanford. And then your first 2 years, you didn't play much and you were kind of on the periphery of kind of being not a role player, someone who, and that's in between your sophomore and your junior year, you go in this insane workout program with, I can't remember, who was the guy again that you
Frank,
who called you sir, right?
Still does.
And then you go to 8 in your junior year, you're averaging 18 points a game, you're all conference, and you kind of fulfilled that, potential, and then you get hurt. But did this perseverance, though, getting back to, I was very impressed that you got to the level that you got, because it was very, is there that thread, that Jewish perseverance that we kind of read about that maybe that, a lot of athletes have, overcome a lot, but you really seem to really wanted it a lot. And maybe because of this inspiration that you had from your grandparents and your dad and your parents helped push you even beyond maybe where you should have gone.
I think so, 100%. It was the fire in my belly. I was fighting for something really big in my heart, and in my mind. People didn't know that, and I kind of am honest about that in the book. Sometimes people ask, like his dad's is an NBA general manager. Like, what's with him? Why is he fighting so hard? But it was always inside of me. And I also write in the book about anti-Semitism I experienced growing up, and that also pushed me. It made me angry. I was always raised to treat people fairly and to care about that. And when it didn't happen to me, I really internalized that, and I use that as fuel as well. So I had aggression that I kind of, took out on the basketball court. And I'm lucky that I had basketball as a vehicle to kind of try to live those dreams, make those people proud. So yeah, there was that thread of perseverance runs through the generations of our family, but it is a Jewish, it is Jewish themed, because so much of it is because of what my grandparents went through, what we experienced as Jews, in America.
You talked in the book, and you went to play in Germany.
Yes.
Or you were supposed to play in Germany, a big team. Take us through that story, because you had reservations about going there.
Yeah. So I read in the book, I'm likely the only professional basketball player who had to call his grandmother to ask permission to sign his first contract. And I did sign that contract, and I did go to Germany, and I played there for a year. It was after graduating from Stanford. I was going to start my career overseas. And I remember my agent called me and said, "Hey, I got a great opportunity for you. It's with a really strong club, first league in Germany." And as soon as he said Germany, I didn't even really think about anything else. I said, "Well, listen, let me call my grandmother and I'll get back to you." And I called her, and I told her, I have this great opportunity. I never forget, she cut me off. She said, Mazel tov, that's great. And I said, well, listen, there's a problem. It's in Germany. And she said, well, what's the problem? I said, well, you might not be, comfortable with that. And I'll never forget what she said after that. She said, sons are not responsible for the sins of their fathers, which is, it's something I'll never forget. It's such an amazing commentary on her perspective. She said, we can't blame this generation of Germans for what that generation did, because that's what people have done to Jews throughout history. They've blamed us. They've made assumptions about us, and we're not going to do that now. And she said, go to Germany, learn the culture, play basketball, and that's what I did. And I had a very, very profound experience there. I visited the site of the Nuremberg rallies. I toured the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, and it was kind of a coming full circle moment for my family.
Did people over there, did they know that you were Jewish?
I'm not sure if they did or they didn't. It's not ever something I concealed. It's not something I'm a proud Jewish person, but I just kind of went about my business. I'm sure that some people did know, some people didn't know. My teammates certainly did, because I mentioned this in the book a bit about just kind of the feeling of otherness. Being a Jewish athlete, I was the only Jewish player on most of my teams, and my rookie year in Germany, our team said a prayer before games. A prayer to Jesus Christ, and to my teammate's credit, he came up to me before. He said, "Hey man, like we want to say a team prayer. Are you comfortable with that? Is that okay?" So he respected that, that I'm Jewish. And I said, whatever the team wants to do, I didn't say the prayer, but I just respectfully kind of stood. And, but yeah, so they certainly knew.
Great. You write in the book, and it was interesting because people don't realize the Jewish heritage of basketball, especially in New York City. Can you detail a little bit of that for there is a deep heritage of Jews in basketball, and then again, this was a Jewish game at one point.
Very, very much so. Basketball was an immigrant game in New York City in the 20s and 30s. Played in the tenements mostly by Jewish immigrants, and so that's where the game started. The first NBA game was played in 1946 by the New York Knicks and the Toronto Huskies, and all 5 members of the Knicks starting 5 were Jewish. And actually, the first basket in NBA history was scored by a man named Ozzie Sheckman from Kew Gardens, Queens. Right next door from where my dad was from when he came to the States, in Forest Hills, Queens. So yeah, basketball has very deep Jewish roots. And I include a quote in the book from the sports editor of the New York Daily News in the 30s, which is an anti-Semitic quote talking about how
it was a prominent. I can't remember the sports writer. I mean, it was a very legendary sports writer who said that.
Guy by the name of Paul Gallico, famous quote,
legendary sports writer.
Yep, and he said, well, kind of something to the extent of course, basketball is a Jewish game because basketball puts a premium on smart aleckness, dodginess, craftiness. So this idea
being shifty, I think being shifty was in there.
Correct, right? The shifty Jew is a good, and then obviously that's anti-Semitic tropes, up and down that comment, but also just speaks to basketball was a Jewish game when it started.
Rabbi, do you have a question, or?
I do. I want to move a little bit further into the anti-Semitism, the state of where we are today. The shocking survey we've talked about in many sermons at the synagogue and teach in many classes, right? That alarming survey that 1 in 10 Gen Zers haven't heard of the Holocaust. 1 in 10 thought that Jews were even a contributing factor in the Holocaust and the hate against Jews at that time. We see a rise in anti-Semitism in this country, in Europe, around our world. I'm wondering, Dan, what messages do you have for young people in particular who might pick up this book, right? Who have little to no experience with Judaism, with Jewish history, with Holocaust?
Absolutely. First and foremost, I hope they do pick up this book, and that's one of my dreams writing it, because there's an accessible sports story, which young people like. It's interesting, it's exciting, but underneath that wrapper is this really important history of the Holocaust. And so I hope they do pick it up. So what I would say, first of all, to Jewish kids who maybe have experienced anti-Semitism, is you're not alone. And I write about that in the book, about going to a baseball field in my hometown, opening up the equipment shed there and seeing a white swastika painted on the inside of the door, which I'll never forget. Being called names, hearing people make comments. And so this is an unfortunate reality that we face as Jews anywhere in the world. And so certainly if you're Jewish, you're not alone. If you're not Jewish, understand that this is something that your Jewish friends go through. I always tell young people to be, especially young Jewish people, be proud of who you are, and stand up for yourself, but also stand up for others. We need voices today. There was a point in history where we really needed voices and there weren't enough of them. We really need voices today too. We need to be voices for other people. So anytime that folks aren't being treated fairly, groups of people are facing prejudice or injustice, we need to speak up against that. And listen, we can turn on the news today and there's such sobering examples of that, right? Of what's happening to people in the world, right? We need to always stand on the side of good, and we need to tell these stories. We need to know our history and tell them. And the last thing I'll say, particularly as it relates to Jewish youth, is we need to be close as a community. And we are, and listen, we're Jews congregating here tonight to talk about a meaningful story. That's, I think, part of why Jewish communities are so tight-knit, because we need each other, and we always will. And so those are, some of the lessons I try to impart on the younger generation. I hope a lot of kids, Jewish and non-Jewish, pick up the book, get a chance to read it. There is this fun sports story, but there's something a lot deeper and a lot more important going on.
I agree with that. I mean, it's a very interesting story. Your story was an interesting story, and then the story of your family. You mentioned Bernard King, and he texted, did you still, you said you're still in contact with him? I think Uncle Bernard or Uncle Bernie, you called him in the book?
Uncle B. He calls me Danny Boy. Listen, it's amazing because my dad and Bernard their histories are so tied together, and they played for the Knicks with each other. So right. Bernard lived up the street from us, and that's how I know him so well, because he was around when I was born. And I write that in the book. The week before I was born, there was a road trip, and Bernard had 50 points on back-to-back nights, which was like a very famous thing he did. That was a week before I was born, And so, my dad and him still talk every month. I was, I'm in DC where my parents are, and I was at their house. It was probably 2 months ago now, and my dad kind of yelled for me. He said, "Hey, Dan, come in here. I'm talking to a friend of yours." And I walked in, and it was Bernard, and he said, "Danny Boy," and that's the relationship. So very special thing, and again, speaks to basketball bringing people together.
Can you talk? You played in Israel. I'm just curious. You played in Israel for how many years?
4 years.
4 years. And you had family in Israel too, right? Your family almost ended up in Israel. I think you could have gone, but that's that was part of the story. But they went to the United States instead. But what was the culture of sport in Israel, especially basketball? I know they're big basketball fans. What we got into this in our Jews and Sports series about sports in Israel. What did you observe about sports in Israel and where it kind of fits in the culture?
It's a big part of the culture. Very passionate fans, and it's community oriented, right? So fans pick a team that's in their city, and they really love it. It's a little different than the States because the teams here, the fan bases are so big and they're a little more dispersed. Like in Israel, where you're from, you really root for those teams. You root hard. In the case of basketball, Maccabi Tel Aviv is the main basketball team in Israel, and they're like a national treasure, but it's bigger than sports. They really put Israel on the map in the 70s in a lot of ways by winning the European Championship. And, Tal Brody, who's a, basketball legend from the University of Illinois.
University of Illinois, right?
I knew you were going to get there. But, Tal could have played in the NBA, Jewish man, went to Israel, was a legend, still is. He's a friend of mine. And talk about Jewish pride and that thread, like for Maccabi Tel Aviv, the team from Israel, to win the European Championship in the 70s, it was such a source of pride and inspiration for Jewish people all over the world that to this day, Maccabi Tel Aviv is just like this beloved institution. And so that kind of informs the whole feeling of sports, because it can do so much, because it really put Israel on the map. And there's a documentary film called
Right.
On the Map, right? Which talks about this phenomenon. And so, I love playing there. I mean, the fans were great. It's a good league. I'll tell you, like, I would go to national team games. A lot of my teammates and friends played for the Israeli national team, and it was like a bar mitzvah. Like everyone's dancing and hugging, and like I remember saying to my wife, like, this is one of the coolest things ever. Just like, the pride that the country felt in these athletes was really special.
And you did get a chance to play at least a cup of coffee with the Knicks. What was that like for you? Or at
Yeah,
least put on the uniform.
I did. It was great. There wasn't as much nostalgia as they probably warranted. My dad used to watch the Knicks from the last row of the bleachers as an immigrant, healing from the loss of his brother, didn't speak English. And then he never could have imagined he'd be playing on that court and then the general manager of the team, right? That's how much the Knicks meant to our family. I had the chance to go to training camp with the Knicks, and I was this close to making it, but it was in the heart of my professional career, and I was just really focused on becoming an NBA player. I thought I had the ability to do it. And so I took small moments of time to kind of savor the experience, but not enough. And so we all look back and say, oh, I would have done it differently. Like, I wish I would have taken a breath, looked around, smelled the roses a little bit to realize how cool that was to be able to, put on a Knicks jersey, go to practice every day. And it was pretty special.
Great. You want to, Rabbi, what do you have more questions here?
Just one last question. What's your mile? How many minutes are you running a mile these days?
I thought you were going to say my best. It's funny because I was proud at first because I have a really good best mile time, but then you said nowadays, and then I was ashamed. Like, it happened so quickly. Oh my gosh. I don't even want to speculate what my mile time would be now, but it was surprisingly fast in my prime. I was never like a great sprinter, but I was somehow a good distance runner. I had good like pacing and feel. And in the book, I won my team mile several times, and particularly after I came back from my injury, which was kind of a triumphant thing. So I had a very good mile time in my prime, not so good anymore.
But can you just, again, I was so taken by Frank, who was your trainer. I just would love to hear more about, if you haven't read the book, Dan went. Then I don't know that the Navy SEALs had anything on you. What you did in between your sophomore and your junior year during the summers, just to describe that workout program, and it really did transform you into a great player.
It did, and so Frank was my trainer, still a dear friend of mine, a character you'll read in the book. It's funny. He should have his own book, his own television show. He's really one of a kind. But he used to train people from the military, and he actually gained quite a bit of notoriety after he trained me because he started training NBA players, much more prominent than myself, and did a great job with them. And so very, very skilled, gifted person. And the training that I did is a commentary on how bad I wanted it and really how much the story meant to me. And again, I'll hold up my book, By the Grace of the Game. It was the game of basketball that gave my family a life in America. This is the history that I'm carrying that I wanted to make good on. And so all these things were driving me. And so the stuff I did with Frank, it really is a representation of that drive. And so we would sprint the sand hills and do these crazy exercises. And he would mentally push me and not play with me, because there's always a method to his madness, but he would bring me to my breaking point, physically. And just the most, I remember pulling, I didn't write this in the book, sprinting in the sand, pulling a sled with people on the back of it, like things like that, carrying buckets of sand, like just very hardcore things. And he told me, he said, listen, 1 in 7 elite athletes come back from more of my training. And he said, your mind will always give out before your body. And, he was right about both those things, because I saw so many people kind of cycle through and the next day they don't show up. And I had heart, and I really wanted it, but he pushed me to the limit. But listen, the proof was in the pudding. I went from averaging 3.4 points per game as a sophomore to 18 points per game as a junior. I was the most improved player in the country. And so, and by the way, the values of my family is work, right? My grandparents opened up a fabric store in the Bronx. They worked. My dad had that ethos. He worked to get to the University of Tennessee, become a star. I just had to put in the work, and I did that. And Frank was a big part of that.
Rabbi, before we open it up to questions, one final. When you write this book, and then what kind of reaction did you get from your father and your grandmother? How did they, and were you nervous about how they were going to, react to the book? Because this is, you're telling their story. How did they feel about it?
So to the question of was I nervous? Yes, very much so. And some people ask, like, what did they say when you told them I'm going to write this book? And so I never ever said to them, I'm going to write this book. I said to them, I wrote the book. I didn't tell them.
You didn't tell them before, you didn't tell them it was done when you were?
No. So when we did all that research, I told both of them, I have a project in mind. I just want to really understand our history. I did that. First of all, that just felt true to me at the time and it felt right. But I think in retrospect, I needed to create space to have really honest conversations about really difficult things. And I don't think the book turns out the way it did if I didn't have that space. You know, and my family is very close. I wasn't like pulling one over on anyone or concealing anything, but that was part of it. But then also just my journey with the story. It's so emotional. There was so much for me to process that I just needed space from it. And even for my wife, I told her, you know, when I wrote my first draft, I woke up at 6:02 a.m. every day for 8 months to finish it. And I said, listen, you know, I'm working on something. We kind of set guidelines. I said, I don't want to talk about it. I just want to kind of go do it and leave it there because, and you know, from the book, it's my soul on a page, you know, so I needed that space. And when I was finally done, I said to my family, you know, I wrote the story, you know, everything, all the things we've always talked about, like I wrote it all. And they were very surprised, very grateful, you know, that I'm memorializing this story, very proud of me. It's been difficult, particularly for my dad. And you know this from the book, basketball gave him separation from all these really, really difficult things. Right. You know, it brought him away from this tragedy and he's never chosen to look back or had to look back. And I talk a lot about privilege in my book, and I'm privileged for a lot of reasons. One of them is I have a generation of separation from all that tragedy. So I can look back on it and reflect upon it and gain inspiration from it. And so for me, I was able to do that. For him, he doesn't have that luxury. So definitely been difficult for him. But ultimately, it's a beautiful thing. You know, I talked to my grandmother lives in a retirement community in the Bay Area. I talked to her community recently on Zoom. They're all reading the book every day. My grandma says, "Oh, I saw this person. They read the book. They love it." You know, that's the greatest gift. And another thing is my grandma always talks about her family who was killed in the war, and to a certain extent, my uncle. And he says, you know, people won't know they existed. You know, and for those who were killed in the Holocaust, they were just sent to Auschwitz and never heard from again. You know, they don't have graves to visit. They don't have death certificates, but their stories now live forever in my book. You know, so that's another really meaningful part about it. And she said to me so many times just how proud of me she is. And she'll say, I have the greatest grandson, you know, because it just means, you know, it means so much to her. So for me, there's nothing more special than that.
I mean, as you said, this story now will live as long as there's libraries and, you know, and whatever, Kindles and whatever, people, the story will live on. And that's probably the greatest gift that you could have given to both of them.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that.
This is a great place for us to hit pause and to see if there are questions from the Zoom boxes in front of us. We'd ask you to just put up either the virtual hand and I'll call your name, or go ahead and wave your real hand and I can call you by name so that you can speak and have some space. Yeah, Molly.
Hey, Dan.
I was going to say, Molly knows me so well that she has to ask the question, but then she can answer it.
Okay.
It's all right.
I think I could probably do the talk along with you at this point. But so hi, everyone. I'm Karen and Robert's daughter, Molly, and have had the privilege of helping Dan get his book out into the world for like the last mile stretch. But so I guess my question is more of a prompt, knowing, like, having read the book and seen you speak at other events. I was actually thinking a lot about like people having to leave their homes, what's happening in Ukraine and all around Europe, and just like refugees in general. It's not just in Ukraine, but one of the stories that stuck out to me is how your grandparents got money out of Romania, specifically on the train. And I was wondering if you could share that story, because I don't want to spoil the book. There's like lots of good stories still, but that one, like, it was genius, but also just incredibly lucky that it worked, because there were a million like points in the plan where it could have fallen apart and been very dangerous. So just curious if you could share that story.
I will share that story. Molly undersold herself a little bit. She has been right by my side through this very, very important process. So And Karen and Robert have been great sources of support as well. So thank you for that, Molly. And yeah, so, and what's going on right now in the world has evoked so many really deep feelings. I mean, for people everywhere, but for me, knowing what my family went through, seeing what people are going through now, there are such striking and scary similarities. And yeah, being displaced from your home, being forced out, it's such a scary thing. And so in the case of my family, they had to leave Romania as refugees. And so they fled. They weren't allowed to take anything of value with them out of the country. They had saved up roughly $1,000 worth of Romanian money and roughly 4,000 American dollars by transacting on the black market. And I write in the book, it was illegal, but it wasn't shameful. It was the only way to have a life. And so, as Molly said, you know, they smuggled their money out. And my grandparents had chutzpah. They were Holocaust survivors. They weren't being treated fairly, just like we're seeing on the news today, you know. And so my grandparents said, like, we have to figure out a way to get the money out. So the American dollars, which was 4,000 with, I won't spoil that story. It's an amazing one. One of the biggest celebrities in the United States joined the plan and helped my family smuggle their money out. That's a really special one that you can read about in the book. What Molly is referring to with the train. So my grandparents were thinking, how are we going to get this Romanian money out of the country? This is $1,000 worth. We spent a decade saving this up. And so my grandfather had a plan, and he was very connected in the city. And so he kind of asked around and found out what train was going to take my family out of Romania to Serbia and then to Rome. And so in the middle of the night, the evening before they left, my grandpa left the house with one of his friends standing as watch, went to the train station, shimmied his way on board the train. He had this wad of illegal money very deep in his pocket. And by the way, my grandparents had friends who were jailed, tortured, or killed for even possessing illegal money. And that's communism. And I see it on the news today, you know, how people, you know, I mean, God forbid what's happening in Ukraine, but even in Russia, the control of information and people not able to speak out, like, this is communism. And so that's what my grandparents lived under. And so, you know, they took the risk. They had this illegal money. So my grandpa forced his way on board the train. He found a nondescript seat right in the front of the train, took the money, shoved it deep underneath, left the train station, walked home with his friend standing watch. No one saw a thing. The next day they went to the train station, and my grandmother still tells a story about how the communists searched and patted down my 8-year-old dad with his hands in the air, and they got in my grandparents' faces and said, "Do you have any money on you? Do you have anything on you?" And she said, my grandmother said, "We don't have anything on us." And she wasn't lying. The money was already on board. And so the train, you know, took off from the station. My grandfather was kind of, you know, having a fun time with his kids. When it disembarked in Rome, he kind of hung back, went to that seat, took the money out, touched his feet onto Italian soil with $1,000 worth of Romanian money in his pockets that the communists didn't know anything about. So an amazing story. They got the Romanian money out. They got all the American money out. Symbolic of the human spirit, you know, the will to build a life, to have things, to work for things, to provide an education for your kids, right? There's so much wrapped up in that anecdote. Thank you for bringing it up, Molly. It's as if you know what I like to talk about.
Yeah, I just think about, like, I'm a very logistics minded person. So I think about, like, what if they changed the train between when he hit the money and when they left? What if someone else found the money in the seat? What if the soldiers found them? Like, there's just so many points where it could have gone so horribly wrong. And it's so delightful and amazing that it went so right and that they got it out. So
totally. You know what my grandma would say? I think if she was on the call, she would say, "What if we just left it there?" You know, because it's, but you're right. Like, there was 100 ways it could have gone wrong, but it's the fighting spirit, and that's, like, it's worth a shot. And it is amazing that it worked out.
yeah.
And it's also remarkable in that you see these stories of courage in trying to really, I mean, you think my generation, you know, people, you know, we didn't have to, you know, we grew up on the North Shore, and we didn't have to, you know, we had, our obstacles were nothing like that. I mean, the idea that your grandfather had to do something like that, and there's stories that are happening right now in Ukraine where they're trying to do the same thing. It's mind-boggling that people actually get through it and get to the other side when you think about it.
one thing I just want to say that's kind of related to all this, and it's really been on my mind and honestly in my heart recently. And I mentioned it, my grandparents' story, they talk so much about those who helped, and I mentioned a big celebrity helping them. And there's so many instances. If you go through my book, there's someone who gave my grandmother a pair of pants when she needed it. A German officer who gave her bread. There's just like all these figures, these little acts of kindness. And you're seeing that today, right? And I've been so heartened during this incredibly upsetting time about how the global community of good people are banding together to try to help these innocent people. And in my story, I really felt like, in the time of greatest darkness, it's when the light shines, and Raoul Wallenberg being a huge example of that, and all these other people. And it's happening today as well. And so that's just something that's I've been thinking about a lot, like relative to the situation today and what, the story that I tell in my book. And it's something that we can all kind of understand, that at these points of darkness, the humanity, the goodness of humanity can shine brightest. And so I think that is happening today. And there's so many people trying to help, and God willing, things get better.
And it really, and just to extrapolate that out, I mean, someone helping your grandmother or your grandfather get through that experience leads to your father and yourself and all these lives that, that otherwise wouldn't have existed. These your father played on a great stage and entertained thousands of people. You entertained thousands of people, and now you're alive to write, tell this story. It's just incredible how these fate kind of plays this, this role when you, especially when you describe the stories that you tell in the book about your family.
It is, they say like you save a life, you save the world, and the trickle down effect is incredible. And so my dad, right, he was the general manager of the Knicks, so he was in a position of power, and there are people that he really helped, and he has helped a few people early in their career who became billionaires. And of course, it was just like things happen, but think about that effect of, if one thing goes differently with my grandmother, it's just an enormous ripple effect. And that's why they say, yeah, you save a life, you save the world, because so much comes from that.
I know you've done a number of these talks, and I'm sure you love, I mean, you're able to tell the story beyond, and hopefully the book. I mean, your feeling towards what you've accomplished here. I mean, how do you view it? I mean, how do you view this whole adventure that you've been on and continue to go on with, as you continue to talk to groups like ours?
Because I do love talking about this story, and it is so meaningful. And for the book, I want to say I'm enjoying it, but I'm a very driven, motivated, intense person. So one of my weaknesses, I don't stop to smell the roses enough. My wife, Sam, is challenging me on that. She's like, and I write in the book about my growth, and there has been growth there. But as the book has been coming out, she'll be like, hey, man, look in the mirror. Like all those things that you wrote, you're doing now, right? Where I can't kind of settle in and realize it. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to do it. Because if I really step back and look at it, it's an amazing thing, because people are reading the book. It's gotten really great reviews and all these things. But again, most importantly, people in my grandmother's community are treating her like the hero she is. Not that she wasn't beloved already, but her story is out there now. And even my dad's, who is a very well-known person in the world of sports, but has never talked about this. And so now people didn't know, right? So for all those reasons, deep down inside of me, it feels really, really satisfying.
See, Karen, your hand is up there.
Oh, I just want to add something, like just one addition to that, some extra color, is that putting a book out in a pandemic is really hard. And you lose out on all these like really fun milestones that I know a little bit about. And so with the help of Dan's wife, Sam, we got him to a bookstore where he actually got to sign copies right the day before the book came out, which like we were masked and everything, but we still got that moment, but you have to like kind of go out of your way in a process like this to enjoy it. So you're doing okay. You're doing fine.
Thank you. Molly would know. Molly's a New York Times bestselling author. So she did. We did our book signing. We try to do these little milestones, and it's been great. But I'm still pushing really hard. We are pushing really hard. Molly's right by my side at that. But I just want the story out there. I want more people to read it. I believe in it. I believe in not only the story, but how I wrote it. And so that's really my dream, is just more, more eyeballs. And so this is part of it, right? The engaging with community. So thank you all again for that.
We've got Karen, and I see Marin's too.
So Dan, I didn't realize you were going to be on this actually when I signed up for this, but since you are, this is what I was going to ask, so I'm going to ask you to answer it. I couldn't help but wonder as I was reading the story, which I loved, by the way.
Thank you.
Who out of you, your father, and your grandmother do you think who had the largest survival story? So in other words, I read it as all three of you were survivors in your own right, all who survived through enormous odds. And I would say, we would all probably read it and envisioned your grandmother obviously as being the biggest survivor, but maybe not. So since you are here and could answer that, I just wonder from your perspective, who you really think survived the greatest challenges.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Thank you for reading and enjoying the book. And I've never been asked that before, which I really love. It makes me think about it. It is my grandma. It is my grandma. Although I thought about it, because my dad went through a lot. I mean, to lose his brother at that age, to have to flee his homeland and to not speak the language. There was so much that he overcame. But if you look at my grandma, losing both parents, losing 5 siblings, I mean, literally surviving the Holocaust, but then all the things under communism, and then losing a son. I think the combination of all those things. I mean, she's the protagonist. She's the star. She is the main character. My dad said recently when we did an interview together about the story, he said, I was a good basketball player. My son was a good basketball player, a good writer, but my mother is a hero. And her star shines brightest as it should. It's really a celebration of her more than anything. And so it's a great question. It's a thoughtful one, and it's one that's made me think. But yeah, it is my grandma. What do you think? Do you agree?
Oh, yeah.
Well,
I agree.
I do agree. But as I read it, I was originally thinking when I read the jacket and I happen to be a huge sports fan, so I knew who your dad was and all of that. As I read it, I was originally thinking, are we supposed to be reading this as, thinking that and the obvious when and everything that we've read about the Holocaust, we're supposed to think that whole generation really survived. But look how much I flip-flopped a lot. Look at how much your dad had survived too, because of all the odds that he had to overcome, not speaking the language, having to hide the fact that he wasn't an English speaker, always having to hide everything. So he really had survived so many obstacles too. So I did flip-flop.
Yeah.
But obviously, ultimately, she, there's nothing in my mind like that. I could never.
Yeah.
It must be like to come through the Holocaust. I can't fathom it.
Yeah. I agree with you. I look at it the same way. You can make a case for my dad, but I think it's my grandma.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that's Marin's. It might be Terry.
It is me, and yet it is always inevitably my mother because she has created this person here. So both and. Dan, thank you so much for being here. And this book, oh my goodness, I think it is just incredible. It is an invaluable piece of literature, in the writing, certainly, in the content, certainly. And for me personally, I have not felt as much a part of a story and a part of a legacy as I had in reading this. And I'm so grateful for that. And I have forwarded the title to all of my Jewish basketball playing friends and many other friends. So excited about it. And I'm a teacher. And one of the things that I discuss with students around passion is that question of why. So I have students take inventory of what is it that you love to do, and then really think through why is it that you love to do it. And so with that, one thing that, and I would love to teach this book with my students. I look forward to doing But one of the things that you spoke so beautifully was that I started to see basketball as representing what mattered most to me instead of being what mattered most to me, that family and values were forever. And I don't know as much if this is a question, if you wanted to reflect on that quote at all. It just, I wanted to kind of speak to the fact that resonated so deeply. And I think that's so transcendent and so powerful, and something I'm holding close to me, the way in which basketball is like operates so microcosmically in this story.
Thank you so much for everything you said. I'm really grateful. If you want to teach a story to your students, just say when and I'll join the class. Even if you don't teach it, I'd be happy to talk to them. So, and I mean that. You can get my information from anyone, and please connect with me on that. Yeah, listen, I mean, I just try to be really honest and open up my heart in this book. And the quote that you read is true, and I because of everything that was wrapped up in the game of basketball, it meant so much to me. It was, my uncle's passing, right? I have his middle name, I felt that, and my grandparents and all these things were tied up in that, and I wanted it so bad. And I had this injury, I kind of, it recalibrated things. And of course I got older, and you get some perspective and you realize that basketball is the vehicle. It's not all about that. It's about your relationships, who you love, who loves you, how you treat people. And so that passage you read was kind of my reflection upon how I grew and how my perspective changed a bit. And so I appreciate you sharing it. I appreciate you feeling the story, wanting to transmit it to others. And yeah, like I said, I'm with it. You get in touch with me and we'll figure something out.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you got it.
Any other questions from anybody joining us here? Dan, on behalf of our entire congregation and everybody joining here, thank you. Thank you mostly for your vulnerability and for your honesty and for your sharing of your full self. We say in the rabbinate when we offer sermons, as if we, stand naked before the person with whom we're speaking, right? Really giving of our souls. And that's what you do in this book, and why it's so powerful and why it touched all of us in unique ways, but also in this shared communal experience. The book is called By the Grace of the Game. If you haven't read it yet, go read it. If you haven't bought another copy for a friend, go do that and give that to them. To Molly, thank you for connecting us with Dan in the first place. And of course, to my partner in sports and in Judaism, Ed. Thank you.
And again, I want to say, I knew I grew up I'm 62 years old. So your dad was right in my wheelhouse when I was kind of getting into, and I know that he was a great player, and I knew the connection with Bernard King, but I didn't know all this, this detail, and to kind of link this, the basketball being being the outcome of this struggle that your grandparents eventually came through. It's just a remarkable story. And I think about how the fact that your kids are not going to be able to read this, and they're your kids, it goes on. That's a great thing about books. And that's the importance of telling stories like this, especially about the Holocaust, because the stories do live on, and it becomes real to people. And they see how people not only struggled, but overcame and persevered.
I'll also say that it's a testament, as Dan and my parents know, I'm not athletic, and sports is not like my number one kind of thing, but I think it's a testament to the writing and the way that Dan has told the story and the story itself, that this is a great book for someone who is Jewish and loves sports, or one of the two, but also like completely, it doesn't matter if you aren't Jewish or don't know anything about basketball, or you played one season in third grade and you didn't know the rules. So just some of us.
The breakaway pants, that was the important her basketball career.
Thank you. So more interested in the fashion aspect, but in all seriousness, I think that speaks to like the way that the kind of pull the curtain back is Dan and I got connected by a mutual friend who said like he's coming out with this book and could like use just a little help from someone who's gone through it already. And I was like, I have like a full-time job, but then she told me what it was about, and I was like, well, now I can't say no. So here I am, and I'm glad that I did it. So, but yeah, it's for anyone, even if you don't know the rules of a single sport or basketball. I think that's a fair compliment to the writing. So
thank you, Molly. I don't know where I'd be without you, so I'm so happy that
I'm just trying to push product, Dan.
listen, I'm with you. Please buy copies, buy them for friends. And no, but honestly, and you know this, it's true. Like the coolest thing is people reach out to me saying, I'm not Jewish and I don't like sports, but I love your book. And that means, now listen, I've had a lot of Jewish people who love sports, who love the book, because that's a concentric circle for the audience. But yeah, it is relatable in that way. So I appreciate the call out, and I appreciate the Dylans very much for all the support, and for everyone, joining tonight. It just means so much to be able to talk about the story. So thank you.
And it's available in paperback now too. Very exciting.
And we should say
And on audiobook.
there's one other Dylan on the call. Molly's Bubby's on the call. So there are 3 generations of Dylans on the call.
Bubby, who I've heard so much about, as I talk about my On You, Molly talked about Bubby. So Bubby, sending love to you, and I'm excited to meet you one day in person.
Oh, she's on mute, but Bobby, you're on mute. We'll pass along.
Okay, cool.
Thank you so much. It was great. I really enjoyed it, and great to know the story. And the story continues. Your grandmother's alive. You're about to have a baby. It's just wonderful.
That's right. And thank you to you for the conversation, Rabbi Daniels. It was great, and I'm just very grateful.